reviewed it at their last meeting. The Blake Street extension, this is a request from Sherwood that was reviewed by the WCCC during the regional flexible funds allocation process, and the WCCC did recommend advancing the opportunity fund request, but unfortunately during that round it wasn't selected due to some of the criteria that limited the competitiveness. So Sherwood is currently seeking funds through a federal program, the U.S. Economic Development Administrative Public Works and Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. It's a mouthful for this. And the WCCC TAC at their June 4th meeting did recommend approving this request. Next slide. I'll let Sherwood speak to that if they want to any further or respond to any questions that come up, but just to let you know where the fund currently stands, we have about $4.8 million remaining for the through FY23. We do have some upcoming opportunities. There will be a state request for proposals for safe routes to school, competitive infrastructure, as well as program funding. And then there is an anticipated Oregon Community Paths program, which is kind of it's the Connect Oregon funding, as well as some of the new dedicated bike and pedestrian funding that came out of the HB 2017 fund. So we anticipate that in early FY20 or in calendar year 21. And with that, happy to answer any questions, and then staff from Sherwood can also respond to the funding request and or the mayor.
The way it was set up on the agenda was that item 4 would be the fund overview, and then item 5 is the $175,000 request from Blake Street. And my suspicion that the good mayor of Sherwood probably would be happy to make a motion to do that.
Yeah, so moved, please.
Is there a second?
Denny seconds it.
Okay, thank you, Denny. Is there any discussion? We do these, I mean, this isn't a lot of money. We do these pretty perfunctory unless somebody has some concerns.
I don't have any questions, but I have a comment.
Please.
And that is simply, I believe that one end of the rainbow is in Cornelius, the other end of the rainbow is in Forest Grove.
Okay. Thank you for the comment. Anything else on the 175,000 other than the rainbow? All in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Aye.
Any in opposition? Okay, it does pass. So that brings us to the 6th item. We have some TDT and TIF on.
Roy?
Yes, sir.
If I could ask one question on the
sure
on the material that was in the packet,
please.
Concerning the Safe Routes to School project identification. There's a series of, they talk about the $750,000 allocated in the program, and then has 3 bullets on it. And then the paragraph following, grant solicitations for both the SRTS program opened in April 2020 with letters of intent due June 15th, 2020. I'm just wondering, it's amusing that today being June 15th, this is obviously not the first time that we've been apprised of this particular situation. I would surmise that this has been information that's been out for cities in the county and so on and so forth for a good 3 or 4 months. I'm correct in that, right?
Erin, would you like to respond and give the mayor some information, please?
Yes, we've been aware of this for a couple of months, and the cities had a discussion about this at the last TAC meeting. So cities that are preparing these grant applications should have their letters of intent ready to go in today. The letters of intent are required. So if that's something any city staff need help with, we're happy to offer that assistance today. The applications are not due until the end of August.
Can you, for the mayor there, could you kind of give a rundown of what you know might be in the pipeline? Do you have any idea what,
As far as who is going to be applying for these grants?
right, the cities? Do you know of any? I mean, you may not, but I just,
Off the top of my head, I know the county and city of Hillsborough were planning on submitting for them, and I will turn it over to Diami if he has heard from others as well.
Yeah, the city of Beaverton and or the Beaverton School District will also be seeking funds.
and those are the only, that's the only
City of
one that you
Tigard
know.
as well for their
Tigard is?
program.
Okay.
Yeah, I didn't mean to be derogatory or anything like that,
No,
or
you weren't.
accusatory. I just, that date just sort of jumped out at me, and I said, geez, I'm familiar with June 15th. That ought to be occurring pretty soon. So I was, it
Good
just
question.
struck me as interesting. So thank you for the update on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Pete. Anything else? Or do we move down to item 6, which is the TDT and TIF some expenditures? There's a couple out in Hillsborough Way. Aaron, are you doing that one again?
I am. So we received requests to spend TDT and TIF funds, the Transportation Impact Fee funds from City of Hillsborough. Washington County staff have reviewed these requests and we find them to be consistent with the program rules and therefore eligible for funding. The TAC did recommend these projects for funding at their last meeting.
Is there anything that Hillsborough would like to add?
Nope.
Just vote for them, huh? Okay.
So moved.
Second it.
I hear a motion and a second. Is there any discussion? Okay, all in favor, say aye. Aye.
Aye.
Any in opposition? Sounds like it was unanimous. Great, thank you. So we finished item 6. Item 7 has been put off forever, and is Todd here? I don't see his name.
Yes, Todd's in the room with us here.
Oh,
and ready
good.
to go. So Todd, you want to go ahead and we'll get that presentation loaded here. Okay.
Hey, good afternoon, Todd Watkins, and the Road Operations Manager for LUT. And this is our second go round now, trying to get this in front of you, so I'm glad we made it work. There's just a handful of slides that we'll go through, so we'll kind of get through these pretty quickly, and then if there's any questions at the end, I'll be glad to answer anything that you might have. So a little bit of background. What happened was we got approached by ODOT along with 23 other central and western Oregon counties to look at our local routes that could possibly be alternative routes to the state highway system on the tier 1, 2, and 3 state lifelines, with the intent of looking specifically for bridge deficiencies. The bridges that were either vulnerable or potentially vulnerable were the ones that ODOT had the most interest in. So what we did was, working with our city partners, we had a subcommittee that was formed, and we looked at a variety of alternate routes that would basically take highway traffic in the event of a seismic event that would go from the Wilsonville area north to handle the I-5, 99W, and 217 corridor. And then the east-west route was Highway 26 from the Multnomah County line out to the Coast Range. So that's the task that we had. And next slide, please. These were the routes that we looked at with 2 tier 1 routes and then a tier 2 and 3 route. Interestingly, there were not a lot of options that we had once we started looking at it, because the goal of this was to avoid bridges and to try to find routes that would be sustainable and resilient after a seismic event. So we went through a pretty exhaustive review of the different routes, and the next slide will actually be a graphic that illustrates what that looks like. The gold routes that you see on the map are actually those state routes that we talked about. So I-5, 99W, 217, and 26. And for the routes that we evaluated and considered, those are the blue routes. And it does a pretty good job of going around any sort of bridges or other impediments that might occur. Most of these are county roads, although there is Highway 8 going through Forest Grove and Cornelius, either end of that rainbow. And then we also have some Beaverton streets as well that needed to be considered because of the overpass on 217 at Allen, which was one of the, if not the, I think it was the only bridge that would actually be standing after an earthquake. So we did consider that to make that east-west connection over onto the east side of the county. So at the end of the day, what ODOT wanted to do was to see if there was a way to have this alternate local system that would actually be cheaper to bolster than the state system if they looked just at their facilities. And sure enough, the numbers do speak for themselves. Looking at the number of bridges that are on the system that ODOT would need to deal with, you're at $150 million. If you look at our local bridges, we're at $39, $40 million. Now, interestingly, there are actually two bridges within that $39 million number, which are actually state bridges. And the reason why we had to include those in the alternate route package was because without those bridges being reinforced or replaced or retrofitted, then our alternate routes become useless. And that's the bridge on Highway 26 that's just west of Timber Road. And then it's also the bridge on I-5 at Ellingson, just at the south end of the county. This does not include the Boone Bridge. We know the Boone Bridge is a huge element to any sort of regional seismic resiliency plan, but we're only looking at bridges that are inside of the Washington County limits, and that's just outside of the county border. So the next slide will actually show a breakdown of what the improvements would look like. So as you can see, there are some bridges that are important from the ODOT system that would need to be considered. The one bridge that's kind of in the middle of things is the Dairy Creek Bridge, just outside of Hillsboro as you're approaching Cornelius. And that one I think has been on a lot of people's radars for a long time. So between that and then the two exterior bridges on 26 and I-5, that would be something that ODOT would have to consider. We did look at one alternate route for the I-5 Ellingson Road alternative, but that actually takes you through Clackamas County. So we wanted to avoid going through another jurisdiction and trying to keep everything within Washington County. So these are the routes then that we came up with, and as you can see, there's only two county bridges, and then we do have one slide that we would want to stabilize out on Timber Road. And if anyone knows Timber Road, it's the only north-south route that we have on the west end of the county, and it's often used now currently as a detour route for ODOT if there's a crash either on 6 or 26. So Timber Road, we know, will be an important route in the event of a seismic event. Most of the bridges on that road are in good shape. We've had some replacements recently with modern bridges, and there are some culverts that have been replaced. So the stabilization of the slopes are really the most important thing out there. So graphically on the next slide, you'll see where those bridges are. So at the far west end, you can see we've got the Highway 26 bridge, the Timber Road slope stabilization. There's that Dairy Creek Bridge. I'm going from left to right. Dairy Creek Bridge between Forest Grove and, Cornelius and Hillsboro. And then the two purple bridges are the two county bridges that we would be interested in working on, and then the I-5 bridge down at Ellingson. And that really are the only bridges that were vulnerable or potentially vulnerable that we would have to consider. The reports and the analysis did not include any single span bridges, so there are more bridges out there along these routes, but these were only the ones that we were asked by ODOT to consider. So 40 million versus 150 million, and it is clear that the local system would be a better value to actually provide some alternate options for the state. So that's in a nutshell what the analysis came up with. So we will be working with the RDPO on the upcoming ETR project, and they have our information, and we'll be merging those together. And then we will be, we got some comments back from ODOT, which we are reviewing and analyzing. And so we will put together some updates that they're asking for. And then hopefully we'll have a final product by sometime this summer. If there's any questions, I'll be glad to answer them.
Now, Jeff, I see his hand up. You're mute. There you go. You're muted again.
Keyboard not agreeing with me there. Hey, on the Dairy Creek estimate, does that basically get us a bridge that's just like it is now? Because the concern is we have deficiencies on that bridge, right? There's not really any good bike ped crossing. Basically, mothers of Cornelius won't let their children go to Hillsborough over that bridge.
Right.
If the cars are one thing, but not on a bike or walking.
Sure.
So
these are what we call planning level estimates. So these are really just order of magnitudes for comparison purposes. These are not intended for any sort of scope or scale of project as far as what the amenities are going to look like, any sort of extras as far as lane considerations or that sort of thing. We're basically just trying to compare apples to apples. And so what the final bridge would look like really is at the point where once it got funded and you started to get more into those details. But this is just for order of magnitude comparison purposes. We did not get down to those project level details.
Okay, gross reality basically said 4 lanes across, and it's about this long, so X.
That's
okay, I just trying to understand what level, because I know we just got that road study analysis done that said, hey, Dairy Creek Bridge came up on that too for safety issues. Correct. As far as pedestrians and bikes. So no, I just want to understand. So it's probably more than that, but we're not sure about how much more.
Correct.
No, that gives me an understanding. Thank you.
Yep.
So Mayor Serrato has a hand up, Mayor Bubenik, and then it looks like Mayor Knapp as well.
Great.
Yeah, Todd, Gary Serrato from Durham. This is just an out of curiosity question. There is a bridge that spans the Tualatin between Tualatin and Durham. Did that, to your knowledge, ever play into this mix? And if so, can you explain a little bit about how it did or did not?
I can speak about specific bridges and the one you're talking about. So I'm not sure if I had more information about which one it was. I could look into it, but I'm not sure which one you're talking about specifically.
Okay, it's
that's the Boone's Bridge, isn't it?
Yeah, it connects Tualatin and Durham off of Boone's Ferry Road, runs parallel to I-5. It's just 2-lane. But as I said, just out of curiosity, just if a bridge like that did in any way factor into the county's role.
Right. So what we looked at were bridges that were identified as being either vulnerable, potentially vulnerable, or not vulnerable. And so if it was not vulnerable, then it wouldn't show up as a bridge that would be considered for a retrofit or replacement. So it very well could have been part of that. It just was sufficient to be able to handle a seismic event.
Okay,
so
because that's where I guess the kind of prompted my question. Would it be fair to assume then that it was not considered a vulnerable bridge? And I'm going to take from your response that may be in fact how it's considered.
Right, or it very well could have been, and then the routing of the alternate routes chose to go around it because it was vulnerable, and then the costs of that bridge plus another bridge might have been more than what the routes were selected. So all we looked at were the routes. This is not a comprehensive list of all of the bridges that are vulnerable within the county. There are lots of them. And so we were looking at ones that were going to, on the routing, that were going to reduce the number of bridge crossings and that had the most cost-effective use of funds. So It could be a vulnerable bridge. It just didn't make the list as far as the routing goes.
Okay, thank you.
Can you get, before we go to the next speaker, can you get the mayor some information on that, Todd? I think that's really what Gary is saying. He'd like to know that. So
Yeah,
if anybody asking,
I'll follow up on that.
great. Thank
Okay,
you.
appreciate it very much. Thank you, Roy.
No
Yeah.
problem.
Who is next?
Mayor Bubenik was next.
Okay. I see Franken is home there, it looks like.
So yeah, just riffing off Mayor Sherrado's question. I'm assuming that bridge, considering the route looks like it's a little bit south of this Boone's Ferry Road. That's why it wasn't considered, because I know during the traffic at the analysis that TriMet was doing about maybe putting a station further into Tualatin, that they couldn't put anything over that bridge. They'd have to build another bridge for a train to go over, because it wasn't stable enough and is older than the hills. My question is the funding of this. This is all well and good, but how's this going to factor into ODOT's funding in future highway projects to get this work completed? And what's the timeline on this?
Right. So there is no funding for this. This is an exercise for ODOT to plan, because they're looking at, just for Washington County, it would be a $150 million price tag. When they look at all of the western counties, and they look at, as a composite, what the routes might be to where they can still serve that inter and intra-state highway traffic, then they may consider that, oh, it makes sense for us to spend X amount of dollars at the local level than at the state level. So this is a planning exercise. There's no money involved with this at this point. This is an ODOT initiative. There's no state mandate, no legislative mandate for this to be done. This is ODOT recognizing that they have a shortfall in their ability to sustain their bridge infrastructure. And so they're looking at the counties as the local experts, along with the cities, to be able to say, okay, ODOT, we have this alternate route that could potentially be a good viable option for you, so that you can check the box to say that we can get freight, goods and services, emergency personnel in the area in the event of an emergency. So the intent would be that at some point that we would potentially see those state dollars come to the local level, so that we can then reinforce and bolster these routes. But there's nothing on the books at this point in time.
And there's a follow-up question on that. The presentation we were given a few weeks ago with Metro going through the process of looking at their critical routes, does this overlap in any way, or is it two separate distinct projects? Or
no, they're joint.
They have their own set of maps for their critical routes for earthquakes.
Right. No, we are feeding this information into that RDPO project, so it'll be a combined effort.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. And I know Mayor Knapp had a question.
Thank you. I'm really wondering about what the policy implications of this only a study are. If there's $150 million in state routes that need to be done, and only $40 million in these alternative routes, and they decide to invest in the alternative routes, except the alternative routes probably need a lot of other upgrades than just the bridges. But once they've invested in bridges, is that going to imply they're going to push a lot of traffic from the state routes onto these other routes to say, well, you know, we've invested in these alternative routes, use them instead? Does that imply not doing the vulnerabilities on the state routes that are more expensive but are aligned with our generally accepted views of where we want the volume of traffic to be handled? Seems to me there's an awful lot of policy questions behind these kinds of justice studies. So how and when are those sort of policy questions going to come to the forefront for discussion, including local officials?
And those are great questions. And as an engineer, all I'm doing is analysis and data gathering. So the policy discussions, and those are great questions because you're right. There's nothing here that is intended to say that these are the routes that should be done per se, or that the state route should not be done because it might have other implications. There could be other economic factors that are as important or more important than this. So those are all great questions that would be, I think, handled at those policy maker levels, which is not where I'm at. I'm giving the information out, and I think it's one of those topics where you have the information to then consider and have the discussion, but it's not a foregone conclusion about what's actually going to occur.
All right. Well, I appreciate that perspective. I think it's incumbent upon electeds to be alert. Sometimes once we have the engineering data, you develop a certain amount of inertia on these sort of programs. And it's incumbent on those of us on the policy side to pay attention and to ask these policy questions early enough that we don't end up, running down a train track we can't do anything about without considering all of the relevant related policies. So I'm just wanting to raise that and hope that my associates in all the different municipalities will be paying attention over time.
Thank you, Tim. Is there anybody else, Stephen?
I don't see any hands raised. I was just going to note that Matt Freytag from ODOT's on. If I don't know if Matt wants an opportunity to weigh in at all.
Yeah, briefly, this is Matt Freytag, area manager with ODOT. I have not been involved directly in this, so I appreciate Todd's efforts in coordinating with the county and directly with our bridge section in Salem. But maybe now concerns. I think the primary thought here is looking at after a seismic event, what is the resiliency? What can we temporarily at least provide the ability to get goods and services from here to there, and utilizing county facilities, certainly not in any sort of permanent fashion to just push them all over there, but just to look at temporarily what we can do. And maybe this might be a decent time to mention the Boone Bridge on I-5. ODOT did get some funds to look at that, and so we've embarked on looking at the seismic upgrades and potential other modernization of the bridge, and we are working towards having a report ready for the legislature next session.
Thank you, Mark. I'm adamant. Anybody else? All right. Thank you. I know that Todd, that's been on our radar to talk about this topic more than once, and you've been kind of sort of push it off, so we appreciate that.
All right, thanks for your time, everybody.
Thank you. Now we're going to the 2001 Model Code Update. Stephen, do you want to introduce our speakers?
I do, thank you. We have representatives from the Department of Land Conservation and Development. Folks on the call today are Gordon Howard, Ann DeBoe, and Ethan Struckmeyer. So with that, I'll turn it over to you folks.
Thank you. This is Gordon Howard, the Community Services Division Manager with the Department of Land Conservation and Development. And I'll be introducing Ethan to give our primary presentation. He's the lead planner working on the implementation of House Bills 2001 and 2003. We've most of our discussion this morning is on House Bill 2001, which there have been a lot of questions about. That's the bill that requires allowing so-called middle housing in areas that are currently zoned for exclusive single-family residential development. But we also have some information as well on House Bill 2003, which has some requirements for local governments for cities regarding housing production strategies and updating on a regular basis their housing needs analyses. So at this point, I'm going to turn it over to Ethan to give the presentation, and then we'll be available for questions certainly at the end, as I'm sure you'll have quite a few of them. So Ethan, are you on to take over at this point?
I am. Yes. Thanks, Gordon. Hi, everyone. This is Ethan Struckmeyer, Senior Housing Planner at DLCD. Like Gordon mentioned here today, talked about both House Bill 2001 and 2003, or Oregon's housing initiatives. So if you could advance the slide. Great. So I've got a little bit of background here, but I know that the major topic of conversation that folks want to get to today is House Bill 2001 and the model code. So I'm going to go through these very quickly. You'll have these slides, and you can follow the hot link here, the hyperlink, so you can go to our website and find more information if you're interested. Like Gordon mentioned, House Bill 2001 is about housing choices or missing middle housing. And House Bill 2003 is housing production and housing needs. And as Gordon mentioned, an updated housing needs analysis and a new housing production strategy. Next slide, please. All right, so we are currently in the implementation phase of these two bills. So we're in the middle of rulemaking. We've put together a rulemaking advisory committee. There's lots of folks from Washington County area on that rulemaking advisory committee. And we've had our 7th meeting just last week. So we are 7 of 10 meetings. So we're kind of trending towards the end here, but all of these meetings are open to the public. And you can find more information at this link here. Next slide, please. Awesome, thank you. So in addition to the Rulemaking Advisory Committee, we have 3 technical advisory committees. These are a group of very involved, very expert-leaning folks who help us with all of the nitty-gritty aspects of implementing both of these two bills. So we've put together one for the medium and large city model codes, which we'll talk about today, one for the infrastructure-based time extension requests, which is also part of House Bill 2001, and then one for the housing production strategies as House Bill 2003. Next slide. Okay, so first, House Bill 2001. Next slide, please. Thank you. So I put this on here just for kind of context. I know that none of the folks here are representing a medium-sized city, but it's important to understand the requirement because it has some implications on the large and metro cities. So medium cities outside of the Portland metro boundary, 10,000 to 25,000 population. These cities are required to allow for duplexes on all lots and parcels that allow for detached single-family homes and are zoned residential. And so this is for those smaller to medium-sized cities throughout the state, not so much for the large and metro cities. Next slide, please. So more relevant to this group of folks is the requirements for quote-unquote large cities. These are cities in the non-Portland metro region over 25,000 population, but then within the Portland metro, it's unincorporated areas within the metro boundary, and all cities within the metro boundary of a population of 1,000 or more. The requirements for these large and metro cities is that they have to apply the duplex standard. So duplexes on all lots and parcels that are zoned residential and allow for single-family detached homes. They also have this additional requirement, which requires higher level middle housing, what we're calling higher level middle housing, which is triplexes, fourplexes, townhomes, and cottage clusters in areas that are zoned residentially and allow for single-family detached homes. So that's the language there is very different, right? For medium cities, it's all lots and parcels. For large and metro cities and higher level middle housing, it's in areas. And that was a specific language use by the legislature. Next slide, please. Thank you. So part of this is cities are to allow for middle housing. Cities are allowed to regulate the siting and design of these middle housing types, so long as the regulations do not cause unreasonable cost and delay to the development of middle housing. And so we'll talk a little bit about how we can determine a siting and design standard that is quote unquote reasonable. So that's the whole purpose, is for the state has said these middle housing types should be allowed in certain areas of your city, but city, it's up to you to determine how to regulate those. Next slide. Thank you. So as part of the rulemaking process, we are compelled by the legislature to adopt a model code, which is a set of standards that a city can apply to these middle housing developments kind of right off the shelf. And it provides guidance for these cities who might have limited resources, who just need a set of standards that will comply with House Bill 2001. This model code also has a second purpose, and that is to serve as kind of a regulatory or a compliance mechanism. So if a city does not apply any kind of codes to regulate middle housing or does not meet the deadline by which those should be adopted, the model code will apply directly in those instances until such time the city remedies their code to be compliant with House Bill 2001. So there's kind of two purposes of the model code. And we're creating, as part of the rulemaking process, we're creating one for medium cities and then one for large and metro cities. So there's similarities between them, but differences, certainly. Next slide, we'll talk a little bit about the difference between the model code and what we're calling these minimum compliance standards. So like I mentioned, there's kind of two paths for a city to go down. They can adopt the model code, either off the shelf, if they so choose, or through inaction, or they can go their own path and determine the standards that are most appropriate for their communities and adopt those instead. However, as a department, we need to ensure that as we're reviewing those standards that a city decides to implement, we need to ensure that they are in compliance with the intent and the letter of House Bill 2001. So we've created what we're calling these minimum compliance standards, and we're kind of creating these two, like I said, two different paths. The model code needs to be a set of specific standards so that a city can just take it off the shelf, apply it without any further interpretation or amendment. So it needs to be ready to go. And these are the way that we've structured the model code is it provides guidance to cities on certain aspects of siting and design. So they can, if they like portions of the model code, they can, we've written it to be kind of a modular implementation where they can adopt, say, 95% of the model code and pull out specific standards that they don't particularly feel meet their community's needs and plug in their favorite standard. The minimum compliance standards are what define the set of reasonable standards. And this is really where that flexibility lives, right? So the model code needs to be specific. It needs to be explicit about the standards. The minimum compliance standards say a city can explore these set of options to regulate middle housing. And we've set the floor or ceiling about what is reasonable. All right, next slide, please. So throughout the rulemaking process, we've found there's some major talking points that we really need to get through and the discussions that we need to have in order to have a clear set of rules. So obviously the big one is how we define in areas, that very specific language that the legislature used. Also, of course, to set the reasonableness of the standards in the minimum compliance standards and the model code. There's also been lots of talk about how we define a duplex and a triplex and a quadplex and how those look on city lots, if they're attached or detached, or if it's just any number, 2 units on a lot in any configuration, or 3 or 4 units. And then there's some tricky aspects even outside of the plex development. So townhomes and cottage clusters, as you might imagine, are a very unique animal, and how we regulate those from a statewide perspective by creating standards that apply to the entire state can be pretty tricky, especially taking into consideration all the uniqueness across our jurisdictions. The other big piece is how we've heard a lot of calls about local governments, planners, city managers really are seeking the largest amount of flexibility they could possibly find within the minimum compliance standards. And we recognize that that's an important element of the minimum compliance standards. And like I said, it's hard for us as a state to determine standards that will fit the differences between a Hillsborough and a Durham and a Tualatin. So the flexibility is important. And then probably the piece that we've had the most discussion about, the hottest topic in the way of development standards is, of course, parking. So we've talked at length about what parking standards are the right parking standards and how much flexibility should be allowed as part of the model code and minimum compliance standards. Next slide here. So I've put up this, I hope this is easy to read, and I understand that if it's not, but really the most important line here is the last one, the large and metro cities. So these blue dots are our rulemaking advisory committee meetings. So we've got a total of 10 of those for our committee. we're hoping to bring, so we're in the process of formulating the rules now. We're hoping to bring those to our Land Conservation and Development Commission for their first look, the first hearing of those rules at their September meeting, September 2020 meeting. And at that meeting, we'll hear public testimony. The record will be held open until their November meeting. I think that's about the second or third week of November, where we'll hope to adopt those rules and get ready for those large and metro cities to adopt, go through their local adoption process. And that deadline for the local adoption process for large and metro cities, sorry, is June 30th of 2022. So we've given cities a year and a half to kind of go through that process, chew on the model code, chew on the minimum compliance standards, go through their local public involvement process and find the standards that work best for them. Okay, next slide, please. So that's the major piece of House Bill 2001. A secondary piece is the infrastructure-based time extension request. So this is an extension request. It's an application process that a city would go through to say, look, we just don't have infrastructure ready to go to accommodate the increased development that we might see as part of middle housing, as part of allowing middle housing in certain areas of our city. This isn't meant to be a city-wide extension. It's really just a very narrowly focused, area-specific delay in the enactment of the allowance for middle housing. And we are in the process of adopting those rules now. They're actually being sent over to our Department of Justice folks for cursory review tomorrow. So those are in development and should be brought to our Land Conservation Development Commission at their July meeting next month. And then we'll hold a special commission meeting to adopt those in August. And the reason why we're kind of really hurrying to get that done is because applications for these median cities are due to the department on December 31st of 2020. So the sooner we can get that done, the more time that those jurisdictions have to put together those applications. For large and metro cities, that application deadline is June 30th of 2021. So your jurisdictions have a luxurious extra 6 months. So, okay, next slide, please. So moving away from House Bill 2001, I'm going to go through this kind of quickly because I wanted to get to your questions about House Bill 2001. But 2003 is a bill that was passed in kind of unison with House Bill 2001. It is comprised of 3 major pieces. I'll go straight to this middle one here, which is the Hma Update Schedule. And this is a requirement for cities with a population over 10,000 to update their housing needs analysis on a more regular schedule. So in past years, it was kind of whenever it was needed and whenever they kind of opened the books for a comprehensive plan update or some development kind of prompted the housing needs analysis work to be completed. The passage of House Bill 2003 puts that on a 6 or 8 year schedule, 6 years if a jurisdiction is within the Portland metro boundary. So more important to this group here. Tied along to that schedule is a new requirement, the housing production strategy. So these are a look at your housing needs analysis that you completed at 6 or 8 year schedule. 1 year after you've adopted your housing needs analysis, a housing production strategy is required to be adopted. A housing production strategy responds to the need identified in your housing needs analysis. So the housing production strategy is really a list of strategies, tools, measures, policies, so on and so forth that the city will be adopting and implementing to address their housing need that was identified in the housing needs analysis. And this is similar to a housing needs analysis, a 20-year look in the future. But again, these are updated on a 6 or 8 year cycle, just 1 year further into the future to give time for a city to do that work. There's a third part that's a little bit disjointed from the rest of this, mostly in part because it's a prototype, it's a test, it's a pilot case study, regional housing needs analysis. This is a understanding that housing needs aren't just localized to an urban growth boundary, and they extend beyond just a city's limits. A regional housing needs analysis looks at housing need on a regional basis. And so the Oregon Housing and Community Services Department is the lead agency on conducting that analysis for a regional housing needs analysis. The legislature called out that that department would do an adaptation of the California model of a regional housing needs analysis, run that analysis, then critique that analysis and run an Oregon methodology for a regional housing needs analysis. That work is scheduled to be completed, or is required to be completed, by September 1st of 2020. At that time, our department, DLCD, will analyze what OHCS has done and provide recommendations to the Oregon legislature by March 1st of 2021. And then it's ultimately the Oregon legislature's decision on how and if and in what form that regional housing needs analysis continues on beyond just this kind of test case scenario. So that's House Bill 2003 in a nutshell. If we could go to the next slide, I've got a schedule here. So like I mentioned, our department has updated the housing needs analysis schedule. We were required to do that by December 31st of 2019. We've published that already. It's on our website, and those cities who are subject to that requirement are aware of where they kind of fall in that 6 or 8 year cycle. The housing production strategy rules are currently being written, and they fall on the same timeline as the large and metro cities adoption. So first hearing to our commission in September, with hopeful adoption at the November meeting. And then the regional housing needs analysis, September 1st is the key date there. And our department will report back to the legislature before March 1st of 2021. Okay, next slide is the discussion. So I'm happy to answer any questions you might have on any of that. I know that there's lots there.
All right, I know Mayor Snyder's had his hand up for a little while, and I see Mayor Gibson. Are there others? Okay, go ahead, Mayor Snyder.
Yeah, so thank you for the presentation. I do have a question about the part of the presentation where you were talking about cities being able to request extensions in certain areas if infrastructure is not prepared and able to handle expected growth from the changes. You were really specific about calling cities out about that. Does that not apply to urban unincorporated areas? Like, I guess the question is, does that apply to, for example, Washington County outside of the cities, or is that not allowed?
Yeah, sorry, I fall into the shorthand of just calling them cities, but yes, it is unincorporated areas of Washington, Clackamas, and Multnomah counties. However, there's a call out in the bill about just the applicability of where House Bill 2001 applies, and it does not apply to areas in unincorporated county areas that lack sufficient urban services. So kind of inherent in that exclusion from the House Bill 2001 is saying we don't have the infrastructure available, so therefore we're not really subject to House Bill 2001. Gordon, I don't know if you wanted to clarify that.
Yeah, just the thing I'd add is the intent of that exclusion was not for, it was not meant to exclude, urbanized areas of, say, Washington County or Clackamas County that have, water, sewer, transportation. It was meant to exclude the areas on the edges that are in the urban growth boundary in Washington County, but have no services, because this, the most likely it would be most likely the city would eventually annex those. Is those areas aren't required to allow duplexes now. It's only the urbanized county unincorporated areas.
Thank you.
Okay, and I saw Mayor Gibson, and then I see Mayor Truax also has his hand raised.
Yeah, thank you. Your presentation is wonderful. A lot to absorb, but there's one thing that maybe I missed it, but I don't recall conversation about parking standards. Can you tell me a little bit more about what that discussion is really about? We have concerns over parking in King City today on city streets and folks not using their garages and those kinds of things. What does that really mean when you guys are talking about parking standards?
Right. Yeah. So like I mentioned, a city is able to regulate the siting and design of these middle housing types. And so within there's always the question about, okay, well, how does a city regulate parking? And does that cause unreasonable cost and delay to the development of these middle housing types over what is accepted for single family detached homes? So the conversation around parking is really trying to determine to what level parking standards become unreasonable, and to what level are we requiring parking that precludes the development or creates cost barriers to the development or the feasibility of these middle housing types. And so the specific conversation that we've been having at our advisory committee level is, is a certain amount of parking, is it actually an unreasonable cost and delay to require parking? That's one question. The second parking is, okay, we've found that yes, probably is the answer to that question. And so now we need to determine how many off-street parking spaces could a city require of, say, a duplex or a triplex or a quadplex without trending into that unreasonableness category.
Okay, so these are mostly related to multiple unit production.
Correct. Yep. Duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, so on.
Okay. All right. Okay. All right. That makes sense. All right. Thank you.
Yes.
Who is next?
Okay, Mayor Truax had his hand up, and then I see Mayor Knapp as well.
I guess my first comment is for, I don't know anybody on the DLCD staff, would it have been possible to get this slideshow prior to today? I mean, this first time I'm seeing all this stuff. I'm familiar with 2001, not as familiar with 2003, but I guess I'm being hypercritical here. It would have been nice if we had this information as part of our packet. And I would like to have a copy of this. So if you could give that to the county folks and have them send it out to us, that would be most appreciative. The other point on 2001, what's the difference between the model code and minimum standards? If you have minimum standards, why wouldn't we build a model code to fit those minimum standards? And if we wanted to make the model code the minimum standards, why don't we just up the minimum standards to hit the model code? Seems to me that the model code is something that is a little bit more stringent, maybe a little bit more exacting than minimum standards might be. And I'm saying if we have a model code, why would we bother with a minimum standard? It seems to me that the model code would be the de facto minimum standards.
Sure.
Just spitballing that.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. And it speaks to a couple of things. One is the requirement in House Bill 2001 that compels our department to draft the model code for both the providing guidance to a city and then their attempt, or city or a county, in their attempt to adopt middle housing standards. But two, to also be the mechanism by which we can measure compliance. So like I said, if a city doesn't meet the intent of House Bill 2001 or doesn't meet the deadline, then that model code goes into effect. And so for that reason, it does, like you've mentioned, it needs to be exact, it needs to be specific, it needs to be able to be adopted without or implemented without further interpretation. And the minimum compliance, in order to allow for the flexibility of a local government to decide, we don't really like this parking standard that you've provided in the model code, as just an example. The city can say, well, we've got these circumstances that really just makes that parking standard infeasible. And so we need to create room for those cities to determine what the right number is, while also kind of setting a ceiling on what is reasonable and what does not cause unreasonable cost and delay. So the model code, if we just had the model code, we wouldn't be able to kind of set the range between the standards that are acceptable. So hence the purpose for both of those.
I think another way of putting it, Mayor Truax, is that the model code has to be written so that if a city doesn't have a compliant standard, it actually, you know, someone at a building counter could say, well, here's our new zoning code for this provision. Here's how we're going to implement it. And that's, you know, a zoning code language doesn't really have options, you know, give options. Usually it doesn't. And so that's the need for the code. And then the minimum standards, you know, I think it's, you know, what we've seen is for duplexes, there's not a lot of difference. The biggest difference would be, you know, options for parking. But when we get into, and we're still in the process of drafting for the other middle housing types, we've gotten input, you know, from many, including from your professional staff in Washington County, that there are a lot of different issues with, you know, in different circumstances in different neighborhoods and different parts of cities and counties that require different approaches. And they don't, you know, they suggested that it was not a good idea to have try to do a one size fits all for all of that. So while the model code has to be a one size fits all, we really don't want to put cities in a straitjacket that way with, in terms of, and that's why we have the kind of what we're calling the minimum standards, but really a better way of doing it is, you know, options that still meet the goal of the bill, which is, you know, to allow these units without unreasonable cost and delay with reasonable standards, and what doesn't.
And could I just make one comment on on parking standards? At the risk of sounding like Mark Gamba, are we allowing the internal combustion engine and the hybrid and the electric car to sort of, no pun intended, drive planning processes?
Well, we've been working. That's probably the most controversial issue we've been dealing with, and maybe it is driving things because that's what people care about the most. Apparently, you know, I certainly have a lot of personal opinions about it, and we have a lot of people other than local government planners with who are giving us a lot of input on that subject. And I think you know, we're trying to come up with a solution that really, you know, allows for some local flexibility, but sets a standard that doesn't make the car, you know, the dominant predictor of what goes on a particular property. And so that's where we are.
Right. Does that cover, Pete?
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Before we jump to Tim, let me interject something, because I really want to follow up on Jason's comment, and because there's an issue for the county, and here's what it is. We not only have the unincorporated area, but we have a large sewerage agency as well. And everything's under the assumption that these cities or areas are able to do infrastructure in such a way that they can accommodate this change. In large urban areas, that's not always the case. We spec systems for what we thought would be the amount of demand. And so as we have infill in many areas, those systems are not designed to do what is being proposed in 2001. I've brought this up several times at our own board, that we've got a real challenge. So if they're in the cities, and we're in the cities, we operate in the cities in many of them, and we actually, in some cities, we do the entire system, and others we have different arrangements. If we're unable to meet this upsizing that is going to be needed, and you are holding a city unit to a certain time frame, even with flexibility, have we not condemned those properties and we have a taking because we can't service them within a period of time you're suggesting we ought to, simply because we had good planning and we never planned for this sort of density? So I know that's a rambling long question, but I think it's very complex for us. And it's seemingly around the state say, well, the city of X, they do all that. Well, in this area, we don't. We have service districts. I named sewer in some areas, like over in Beaverton, they have a park district. What if they're unable to accommodate certain things? So there's a number of issues that we have that I don't know how the it's all going to play.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, and I know that's a major concern of cities and counties, just about how are we going to make this work, right? But I think there's an important distinction in how this works. There's a difference between allowing for these housing types and permitting these housing types, knowing that the development that goes to your counter and gets applied to your departments need to meet the zoning and the building code in order to get their certificate of occupancy and actually be constructed. And so we're sensitive to the capacity issues at the infrastructure level, and that doesn't say anything about these still can be allowed, but there's some real infrastructure questions that need to be answered as part of how the mitigation of the storm overflow and sewage and water and all of those kind of things play into the actual.
Let me follow up. So they go to Jason and Tiger. There's an infill area. He said, "Sure, we'll allow that." Then he gets a check from the county and our sewage agents. We said, "We don't have the capacity." The poor developer, our builder, they're going to be stuck in limbo for who knows how long. And it could be not just a line down that street. There could be interceptors. There could be large storage design issues. It could be years. So could we be faced with taking issues simply because Jason in his city, he's saying, "Sure, we'll permit it. We have no reason not to. But we're incapable of delivering the service."
Well, I think that Chair Rogers, or Commissioner Rogers, there is a big issue there, and we don't. I mean, it's something that cities and counties and your sewerage agency are going to have to grapple with. I think it's certainly, being a former local government planner myself, I saw oftentimes that there were kind of thorny issues with water, sewer, transportation in particular. Even without the possibility of increased density beyond what the comprehensive plan and zoning allows, and it's kind of a kind of a minuet between what constitutes a taking, what doesn't, what constitutes an unreasonable exaction for a developer. I mean, it's kind of easy, superficially easy to tell a developer, "Oh yeah, you can develop once you have, there's adequate public facilities in this area, and if you go ahead and make those facility changes and apply for some, tenuous or unknown reimbursement agreement, we'll approve your project." I mean, I know that local governments deal with those kind of issues all the time, and this certainly won't make those easier. But I think that it's something that we don't have a good answer for you, but it's kind of something that local governments deal with already, and we. It's going to take some long-term planning and facilities planning to see how to resolve those, and without tipping into the dreaded moratorium statutes of the state or the issues of takings. I certainly sympathize, agree that it's going to be a problem for local governments at times. I think for we had some discussion for areas. It's in a way almost a little easier for areas that are unurbanized now and are being urbanized, say, Hillsborough, South Hillsborough area, things like that, where it's clearly there's a certain amount of public facilities capacity, and a developer can put in certain number of dwelling units in those areas. And what this bill basically would say is that the city can't differentiate and say they can only be single family detached. Right. You have to allow duplexes or quadplexes or townhomes or whatever, but it doesn't change the requirement of a developer to provide the public facilities, or city and the developer together to provide the public facilities to serve that area. So I think probably the area that's going to be hardest to deal with is these areas that are partially developed and have significant infill parcels, which could overtax a existing planned public facilities plan for that area, whether it be sewer, water, or especially including transportation, definitely as well.
Thank you. It is a problem. I think Tim was next.
And then I was just going to say, Commissioner, a couple of things. We will upload the DLCD presentation to the WCCC agenda page. And then I did want to just clarify too, Clean Water Services is being engaged in this process, this planning process as well. So both county, city staff, and Clean Water Services are all participating and trying to assess potential impacts here.
Please just go to the cities, our partners there too, because they're impacted by our
absolutely
our
yes.
activity. Yeah.
Yeah, and I forgot to mention, who is all involved from Washington County area in our Rulemaking Advisory Committee process. Clean Water Services, certainly, Teresa Cherniak and Brian Martin and Colin Cooper. Teresa is from the Washington County, Brian Martin from Beaverton, and Colin Cooper from Hillsborough.
Thank you. Thank you,
All
Tim.
right. And then Mayor Knapp.
Well, thanks. Really good discussion. And I think it is very helpful to have this explicit a presentation from DLCD, even though you don't have all the answers. I think it's starting to take focus, whereas the concepts that we saw in the bills were a little harder to get our hands around. So that worked. I think that the parking question illustrates the difficulty that we face collectively. What's reasonable or practical if you are located along a max line somewhere is different than what's reasonable or practical if you're on the edge of Wilsonville or the edge of Forest Grove or Cornelius or something. The complexity of building something that is able to recognize those levels of difference, whether it's on parking or whether it's on infrastructure pieces or other unique characteristics, will be critical. We have to have a system that works, that the cities can actually apply, not just some esoteric rule that sounds good but really can't be put into practice. So that's the challenge I think we're all facing in how to do this. Then you add that wording that I think is just inviting a long process of definition in the courts about what's unreasonable, cost or that sort of thing. I think that you might have some builders that say, well, building any parking is an unreasonable cost in a particular location. If there's public transportation available, we shouldn't have to do anything. I mean, so I'm sure you've heard these questions. I'm sure you're thinking about all of them, but it's important to recognize the unique differences amongst the relative degree of urbanization in different places, the different amounts of infrastructure available, the different amounts of land, the different amounts of transportation services in a given area. I mean, all these pieces, change wherever you go. So, it sounds like you're working to try to get your hands around that, but I guess I'm adding my voice to the idea that providing the appropriate flexibility to deal with these different realities on the ground will be hugely important in whether we have a structure that we can actually move forward with.
Thank you, Mayor Knapp. I think that's a very good point, and it's kind of a balancing act. On the one hand, we want to give local governments flexibility to craft standards that meet your local needs. And in fact, on that basis, when we started this, some people asked us, why are you coming up with anything other than a model code at all? You're not required to. The statute doesn't say DLCD figure out some minimum standards or define what constitutes reasonable regulation. But I think the alternative would be if we did that, this would be resolved through a long series of LUBA cases. And other than dealing with the death beam stares of the LUBA referees across the street from us, so as they heard all these cases, we obviously wouldn't want that. But also, it wouldn't do anyone any good to have these questions litigated for years. And so we need to come up with some kind of basic guidelines or standards for what constitutes a reasonable regulation to provide some some certainty and backstop for local governments when they make these decisions to defend against challenges such as the ones you mentioned, whether it be a builder or a land use advocacy group or a neighbor or anything else.
Yeah, and I think that's the beauty of those minimum compliance standards, is that's where that flexibility really lives. And like Gordon mentioned, without it, then we're sitting looking at just one set of standards, one specific, very specific set of standards, and then the cities and LUBA need to figure it out from there. So the flexibility is inherent in the minimum compliance standards. It's not a bug, it's a feature.
That also, last comment, seems to suggest to me that cities that really care about how these standards are going to fit to their local community really need to be motivated to develop their own proposal, not just fall back on a generic set that may be provided. Otherwise, that flexibility and that adaptability may be lacking for them.
Right. Yeah, I think in the medium cities cohort, we might see more cities kind of adopting the model code more off the shelf, or 95% or so of it. But for the large and metro cities, I think most will go the route of adopting their own standards.
Okay, well, I hate to bring this to a close, but we're way over, but it's a great topic, and we may have to, Stephen, bring this back at some point.
And I was just going to add very quickly, Commissioner, that the staff from the county, the cities of Hillsborough and Beaverton are coordinating very closely with all the other planning directors. We have a planning director listserv and regular meetings, and this has been an ongoing topic of much discussion.
Yep. All right. Thank you to our presenters. We appreciate
Thank you all for having us.
Thank you.
Pete, do you have an impact update?
Take a look at the last set of minutes that we approved. Just hit copy on that. We're still canceled until basically the end of July, first part of August, maybe on into September. And then those issues that have been gathering dust and also gathering a good deal of consternation will be front and center, but no news is no news.
All right, thank you. Denny, did you have a update?
JPAC? Next JPAC has been canceled, so nothing to report.
That's very, very quick. Are there any other business? Go ahead.
Yes, Chris Steffenbach's here in the auditorium with us. I'm going to look to her to give us a quick briefing on the federal transportation bill, the INVEST Act, that was recently introduced.
Hi, everybody. Thank you. Thank you, Stephen. So this is just really quick. I think some of you may have heard that a little over a week ago, Congressman DeFazio's committee, Transportation Infrastructure Committee, released a reauthorization bill called Invest in America Act. And it is going to the committee day after tomorrow. And with that, it's like 1 week time to pull comments together. Regional staff led by TriMet and Metro have prepared a overall letter sort of support to submit. And I know Washington County signed on to it, Clackamas County and the cities of Beaverton, Gresham, and Portland, as well as the Port and Oregon League of Cities, as well as TriMet and Metro. And so that letter was sent off today. And in addition to that, staff put together some kind of details on different sections of the bill for consideration as the bill is refined. I think it was really refined over the weekend as they're going into their committee this Wednesday. So it's a very quick turnaround. And I think this will be coming up to JPAC again in the future. And I'd suggest that it would be a good topic for a future WCC meeting when we know a little bit more about where it's going and what's in it. Very quick timeline over this past week, just to get a few comments in.
Thank you, Chris. Yep, Pete.
I just got across my email note from Chris Rawl at Transportation for America on the self-same bill. So there's a lot of coordination on this, not only county but nationwide, to get letters to the committee. And they also not only list Representative DeFazio, but Sam Graves, who is the ranking member, Eleanor Norton Holmes from the Highway and Transit Chair, and Representative Rodney Davis. If you would send notes to Congressman DeFazio, you might also copy it to those people. And Chris Rawl also asked that a blind copy be sent to him at Tea for America. So yeah, there's a coordinated effort out there, and I'm glad the county is front and center on this. I could use a copy of the letter you guys sent so I can white out all of the county stuff and put in Forest Grove.
Yeah, I would, and I think it's going to be sent out to JPEC members. We can certainly, when we get the final versions all signed and all, we can forward that to you all here in WCCC. And then I would just like to offer, if I didn't hear the roll call and I can't, with the computer I'm using, I can't see participants. I don't know if there is a Metro Counselor, whether Councilor Dirksen is here. No, okay, I was just going to offer if they wanted to add anything to this. So quick turnaround. For this first shot, more to come, and we'll see about getting someone in as this develops.
Great, thank you.
I was just going to add, Commissioner, that we met with our federal lobbyist last week, and this bill was apparently produced with no Republican input, and seems like it's unlikely to get through the Senate as a reauthorization in the current year. If the political situation changes in Washington next year, it may have more of a chance. And then I think also this bill positions us well if there is some sort of an infrastructure-based stimulus package. I think there are a number of relevant pieces of this legislation that could potentially be incorporated in some form into an infrastructure package.
Yeah,
I think largely the bill is pretty supportive of a lot of our regional priorities here. So again, most of our language is general support, maybe a little bit of tweaking here and there to try to make it a little bit better. But all in all, it looks like a good step.
Right, it's more money, which is good. And Stephen's right, we did hear that. We were pleased to be able to have that opportunity to meet with our NACO folks to get their insight as well. So we'll, although, you know, some, as you all know, some parts of this will live on and move forward. And so it's a good opportunity to get together and begin the, you know, continue the process of prioritizing policies and programs that are important to the region.
Well, thank you. We're over time, and I know these folks all have other things to do. Is there anything else, Stephen or Chris, that we need to cover today?
Nope.
All right. Well, have a nice 4th of July. Thank you for all appearing today, and until next month.
All right.
Thanks, everyone.
See you later. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye. Ooh, get rid of my picture.